Welcome to Lee Anderson's Real World, and tonight I'm joined by the senior political commentator for GB News, that's Nigel Nelson. He's our left in the corner. And the very lovely Emma Webb, political journalist, broadcaster, jack of all trades, or Jill of all trades, can say jack of all trades. Look, straight to it, there's been some happenings this week, Nigel, over the past few weeks, actually, in Parliament. So, obviously, you know, I've joined the Reform Party. Some people say I'm a reformed character. Not sure about that. And we saw George Galloway enter Parliament a couple of weeks back. And things are changing politically. The landscape's changing slightly. We've got a general election this year. Is this the end of two-party politics?
No, I mean, while the first past the post system still exists, two-party politics will carry on. So I think that if you look at the two surprises over the last few weeks, George Galloway winning in Rochdale, you defecting to Reform, I think that your defection is significant because you've got the first Reform MP in Parliament. If the polls keep going the way that they are and you can get 20% of the vote, you're looking at elected MPs for Reform for the first time. George Galloway, on the other hand, not so significant. His fourth time in Parliament, he's always promised to break the mould, never quite achieved it. And the idea that he's got 300 candidates out there for the general election, I don't really believe it, especially as they have to fund themselves. They'll soon realise the expense of that goes further than just losing their 500 quid deposit.
You say, I want to come to Emma now, because Nigel says it's not significant that George Galloway's, but I think it's very significant that you can polarise all sections of society and get them all out to vote and not really talk about the rest of his constituency. It was just one group of people that got out to vote that got him elected.
It's massively significant. I think it's the beginning of sectarian politics rather than the end of the two-party system. The fact that he focused on the Muslim vote, rallied the Muslim vote, postal voting is a whole other aspect of that hasn't received enough attention at all. And, you know, there are other candidates that are planning to stand in other areas. And if he were to support those candidates, and they are, like he said it himself, he thinks that the next election is going to be about Muslims. He is driving a sectarian wedge into British politics. And it's enormously significant because we've seen this on our streets weekend after weekend after weekend, with so many people who have been mobilised against Israel's actions in Gaza. We've seen London become a no-go zone for Jewish people. Yep. So I think it's enormously significant. I don't think it's the end of the two-party system, but I think what we're seeing across both parties, and your defection is a sign of this, is that the rot is so deeply set in both parties. And the only reason why we focus so much on the Conservative Party is because Labour hasn't been in government for so long. And as soon as they are in government, that rot will become very apparent.
So, Nigel, sectarianism in British politics, I think Emma's got a fair point there, and a rot in both main parties. Do you agree?
There's certainly a rot in the Conservative Party, as we've seen. Islamophobia and racism has become a problem.
Oh, hold on, I want to pull you up on that, Nigel. Okay. What is Islamophobia?
Well, there is no set definition.
So why are we using that word?
I think we use that word because it is something that encourages hatred towards Muslims. There's no settled definition of it. I think the danger of British politics at the moment is you'll end up, and both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer are guilty of this. You've got Keir Starmer, who's accusing the Tories of Islamophobia, and the Tories accusing Labour of anti-Semitism. Both are not true as far as the parliamentary parties are concerned, but we don't want the election to come down to a battle between those two sorts.
You mean who's the most racist?
Yeah, yes. We don't want racism to be part of the election.
No, absolutely not. Emma?
Well, I mean, let's talk about the definition of Islamophobia, because there is one definition that has been put forward, and that's the APPG's definition of Islamophobia,
which is pathetic.
And it talks about it talks about this idea of Muslimness, and that if anybody wants to go and look at that report in detail, it's very, very clear that certain criticisms of Islam will be understood as being instrumental in order to attack Muslims. Things like saying that Islam is spread by the sword. So the one definition that I think the Labour Party has adopted, the one definition that is being pushed is is essentially a backdoor blasphemy law. So if we're moving into a potential Labour government that adopt that definition of Islamophobia, plus the potential of either MPs fielded by George Galloway or him supporting other candidates who are sympathetic to that kind of sectarian politics, we are heading towards trouble.
Sectarian politics again, Nigel. I've been in hot water again recently for saying, I want my country back, we want our country back. But this is where we're headed.
I mean, it depends what you mean, Lee, about you want your country back. I don't know whether you mean you want it to go back to something like the 1970s or the 1960s or whatever. But what you've done is you've joined a party which has very simplistic policies at the moment. I'm sure you guys are all going to work out a proper manifesto, but there are so many things that you've put forward now which were fine when you were hoovering up negative votes. But if you're intending now to hoover up positive votes, they need to be sorted out. So it's little things. It's like one policy is to give people who can't get a GP appointment within 3 days a private appointment with a GP. There are 360 million NHS appointments a year, only 3,000 GPs. It doesn't work. You have an economic policy to try and deal with cost of living crisis, which is to bring down VAT by 2%. That is so simplistic because shops are not required to pass on that saving to customers. So it's only at a time of low demand, like during the financial crisis of 2008.
OK, Nigel, I'll come back to Emma now, because Nigel didn't answer anything that I asked him in that last piece. You talked about sectarian politics. I think it's a slippery slope, Emma. I think the emergence of George Galloway, who actually shook my hand and had a bit of a chat with him, but I think the emergence of him just coming and campaigning on one single policy, on basically a group of people, a religion. Imagine if I'd said, Lee Anderson had said, I want to campaign on the next election on Christian people. Mm-hmm. What would the uproar be?
Well, people would find it completely unacceptable, wouldn't they? And I think it's not, with all respect to Nigel, it's not an honest or fair interpretation of you saying you want your country back to think of back in terms of time, because this is about having control. You know, people who live in this country, who have roots in this country, have a right to this country. And what we have at the moment is a situation where we have no control. The government doesn't even seem to have control, whether it's our borders, the NHS that Nigel mentioned. We could talk all day about all of the things that we've lost control over. The situation is completely unacceptable. So I agree with you, Lee. I also want my country back. And I feel like what we're doing is we're selling out the inheritance of our children and our grandchildren, and we are destroying the country as it's been handed to us by the greatest generation. And I don't think that this should be painted as wanting to take the country back to the 1950s, though there were certainly some things about the 1950s that were better
I mean, I don't want to go back, Nigel, to days when we had rickets and polio and scurvy, and there's one toothbrush shed between the old street and stuff like that. What I'm sort of getting at is, well, there's things from the 50s and 60s I would like, but what I'm getting at is, like, we've got literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people now in this country, in their communities, that do not like us.
Are we talking then about the problem of immigration there?
Yes, Matthew, yeah.
OK. Well, again, Reformist policy on immigration is absolutely bizarre. At the moment, you would accept 400,000 immigrants into this country on a kind of net zero basis where one in, one out. How the economy can work on that basis, on legal migrants coming in to fill specific jobs and relying on people emigrating, I'm not quite sure. When it comes down to the cross-channel boats, I cannot see you campaigning on a policy of drowning people in the English Channel, which is what the term...
People are already drowning in the Channel now.
They are, but if you start turning back tiny little dinghies, they go to capsize and more people will lose their lives. It is just not a practical policy to try and turn them back to France, apart from the fact there aren't any international waters between Dover and Calais anyway.
Yeah. Emma, I'll come back to you on this one.
Right.
Is it cruel to turn back boats?
No, it isn't. And if the boat capsized, then they would be under an obligation to pick the people out of the sea. we should be turning boats back to France, I think, and we have to solve the problem. And actually, if you care about people drowning the channel, then what you really need to do is to destroy the incentive that makes them cross in the first place. The problem is that we've become so soft as a country that people think that they can take the mick. And that's not to say that we shouldn't take in genuine asylum seekers, but the fact is that we're taking in so many that we're so overburdened that we can't look after the people who actually need our help.